Suppose you are sitting alone in an empty room. Behind you is a bookshelf holding a single heavy leather book. You know its color, its weight, and the exact shelf where it rests. Now, close your eyes, or better yet, turn your head away. What is happening to that book in the precise microsecond it is no longer being registered by a human eye, a camera, or even a passing insect? Common sense. The comfortable, predictable physics we use to navigate our daily lives tells us the book remains exactly as it was. It is solid, static, and real. But if we zoom down to the fundamental bricks of that book, to the atoms and electrons that give it form, we discover a reality that is deeply unsettling. At that microscopic scale, the moment we stop looking, the book does not remain solid. It dissolves. It spreads out across the room in a ghostly wave of probability, existing simultaneously in 1,000 different places at once. It becomes a cloud of mathematical potentials, waiting in a state of suspended animation. It is only when you turn your head back, when a single photon of light bounces off the page and enters your retina, that this cloud of possibilities instantly collapses. In a fraction of a millisecond, the universe frantically makes a decision, choosing one single location out of infinity and snapping the book back into solid reality. The implications of this are staggering. It suggests that the universe is not a static, pre-existing theater that we simply walk through. Instead, it behaves like an economy of information, a cosmic rendering engine that only constructs reality when there is an observer there to witness it. What if the world behind your back is not a world at all, but a fluid, unformed ocean of potential? This is not a philosophical metaphor or a thought experiment designed to induce existential dread. It is the most robustly tested, mathematically proven fact in modern science. It is the core of quantum mechanics, a field of study that has spent the last century systematically dismantling everything we thought we knew about the objective universe. Yet we have largely chosen to ignore it. We live our lives as if the world is a finished product, a giant, clockwork machine that ticks along perfectly whether we are awake to see it or not. We assume that our eyes are merely passive windows, letting in a world that is already fully formed. But what if our eyes are actually artists, painting reality into existence with every blink? To understand how we arrived at this strange boundary of human knowledge, we must first look at the profound, comforting illusion of the classical world. For centuries, humanity operated under the belief that reality was entirely independent of us. Isaac Newton described a universe that was beautiful, predictable, and remarkably indifferent. In this classical view, if you could know the exact position and momentum of every particle in the universe, you could predict the entire future with absolute certainty. The universe was a great cosmic clock, wound up at the beginning of time, ticking away in the dark. In this clockwork universe, the observer was merely a spectator in the grand gallery of space. If humanity vanished tomorrow, the planets would continue to orbit. The oceans would rise and fall, and the trees would grow in the silent forests. This view of reality felt safe. It gave us a sense of solid ground. It promised us that there was an objective, dependable world out there waiting to be discovered and cataloged. Then, in the early decades of the 20th century, we began to look closer. We built instruments capable of peering into the subatomic heart of matter, expecting to find smaller versions of our clockwork universe. Tiny, solid billiard balls orbiting neat central nuclei. Instead, we found a wilderness of mirrors. When physicists first fired a beam of electrons through two closely spaced slits, they expected the particles to act like tiny bullets, passing through one slit or the other and leaving two neat, parallel bands on the detector screen behind them. What they actually saw was a pattern of alternating light and dark stripes, an interference pattern that could only be created by waves, like ripples in water, canceling each other out and reinforcing one another. This was strange enough, suggesting that solid matter could behave like a fluid wave. But the real shock came when researchers decided to place a tiny detector near the slits to see exactly which opening each individual electron was choosing. The moment the detector was turned on, the instant the scientists began to observe the path of the particles, the universe changed its behavior. The wave pattern vanished. The electrons stopped behaving like fluid waves of probability and suddenly began acting like solid bullets again, leaving two neat, ordinary lines on the screen. It was as if the particles knew they were being watched. This is the famous double-slit experiment, and its results sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The act of measurement, the simple presence of an observer, had physically altered the physical properties of the experiment. It was not that the detector physically pushed the electron. Rather, the mere act of gathering information about the system collapsed its fluid wave of possibilities into a single concrete fact. Albert Einstein famously resisted this discovery, spending the rest of his life searching for a loophole. He could not accept a universe that was so deeply dependent on the mind. He famously asked his colleagues, with a mixture of frustration and wonder, if they truly believed the moon was not there when no one was looking at it. But the mathematics held, and subsequent experiments only made the mystery deeper. If the subatomic world behaves this way, we are forced to confront a massive paradox. You and I, the books we read, the chairs we sit on, and the stars we gaze at are all made entirely of these same subatomic particles. If a single electron exists only as a wave of probability until it is observed, how does a collection of these electrons suddenly become a solid, dependable world? At what point does the fluid quantum haze solidify into the hard, objective reality of our daily experience? We are left with a haunting suspicion. Perhaps the solid world we take for granted is not actually solid at all. Perhaps it is a delicate illusion, a consensual agreement between our minds and the quantum fabric of the universe, sustained only because we never stop watching it. This realization shifts our journey from the cold, clinical laboratory of the physicist to the intimate, psychological chamber of human consciousness. If reality requires an observer to exist in a definite state, then what, exactly, qualifies as an observer? Does it require a human mind, a conscious soul, or simply any physical interaction that leaves a mark on the universe? As we begin to pull at this thread, we find that the boundary between the mind and the physical world begins to dissolve completely. We are forced to look at our own minds not as passive receivers of information, but as active participants in the creation of space, time, and matter. If the universe behaves like a sleeping giant that only awakens and takes shape when we open our eyes, what is it doing in the dark when we finally turn away? To define the observer is to enter a labyrinth where science and philosophy bleed into one another. For decades after the initial quantum revolutions, a fierce debate raged over what precisely forces the universe to choose a single reality out of a cloud of possibilities. Some of the most brilliant minds of the era suggested that it is the presence of human consciousness itself, that a physical system remains in a suspended state of limbo until a conscious mind intercepts the data. Yet, as our measurement tools grew more sophisticated, a subtler, equally profound mechanism came to light, a process known as quantum decoherence. The universe, it turns out, is a relentless gossip. An electron does not necessarily wait for a human being to read a computer printout. It responds to any interaction with its surrounding environment. The moment a wandering molecule, a stray thermal photon, or even a microscopic speck of dust collides with a quantum particle, information about that particle is leaked into the wider world. This constant, microscopic whispering causes the fragile quantum wave to leak its potential into its surroundings, effectively forcing it to choose a definite state. In essence, the environment itself acts as a continuous, ambient observer. The reason the macroscopic world, the chairs we sit on, the buildings we live in, seems so solid and unchanging is that it is constantly being bombarded by trillions of particles every second. The world is observing itself into existence, its components perpetually measuring one another in a dense, blinding web of physical relationships. This understanding rewards us with a striking revelation about our place in the cosmos. We are not isolated ghosts haunting a material world. We are woven directly into the fabric that keeps reality stable. But this insight immediately opens an even deeper, more unsettling layer of the mystery. If reality is sustained by a web of mutual observations, what happens when we intentionally isolate a physical system from this ambient gossip? What happens when we create an environment so cold, so dark, and so completely empty that no stray particles can leak information out of it? In recent years, experimental physicists have achieved precisely this, scaling up the double-slit experiment to objects far larger than single electrons. They have successfully placed large molecules, consisting of hundreds of complex carbon atoms, into states of quantum superposition. Sheltered within high-tech vacuum chambers chilled near absolute zero, these relatively massive, complex structures behave exactly like the ghostly subatomic electrons. The moment we stop watching them, and the moment the environment stops whispering to them, they dissolve into waves of probability. They physically exist in multiple places simultaneously, passing through solid barriers as if they were nothing more than mathematical thoughts. This tells us that the quantum haze is not a strange rule reserved exclusively for the subatomic underworld. It is a universal law of reality. The only reason we do not see our cars or our homes dissolving into clouds of probability when we leave for work is that we cannot isolate them from the environment. The universe is too loud, too warm, and too connected to let its macroscopic structures hide in the dark. But the fundamental truth remains. Beneath the surface of our warm, noisy, classical world lies an ocean of infinite potential, waiting just beyond the reach of our senses. This realization forces us to re-examine the very nature of human perception. If the brain's primary task is to navigate an environment that is fundamentally fluid until it is observed, how does it construct the stable, linear narrative we experience as daily life? Our minds do not perceive the world raw. The brain sits inside a dark, silent vault of bone, receiving nothing but electrical pulses along the optic and auditory nerves. From these ambiguous signals, it must construct a coherent simulation of reality. It does this by constantly making predictions, using past experiences to decode the sensory static. When we look at an object, we are not seeing the object itself. We are experiencing the brain's best guess about what should be there based on the information available. This is what cognitive scientists call a controlled hallucination. When we combine this psychological insight with the discoveries of quantum physics, a startling picture begins to emerge. Human perception is not a passive mirror reflecting an external landscape. It is an active filtering mechanism. The brain takes an infinite vibrating field of quantum potentials and narrows it down into a tiny, manageable bandwidth of sights, sounds, and textures. We do not experience reality as it is. We experience a highly curated, user-friendly interface designed for our survival. We are like characters inside a video game, looking at a beautifully rendered horizon, entirely unaware of the lines of raw code running beneath the screen. This leaves us standing at a profound psychological and philosophical crossroad. If the world we see is a controlled hallucination constructed from an ocean of quantum potential, then what happens to our sense of identity? If the boundaries of the external world are fluid, dependent entirely on the interaction between the observer and the observed, then where does the world end and where do we begin? We have spent centuries defining ourselves as separate egos looking out at an objective universe. But if the universe requires our observation to stabilize into reality, then the observer and the observed are not two separate entities. They are two sides of the exact same coin. What if the profound isolation we often feel in the modern world is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship with reality? What if the universe is not an indifferent machine we are trapped inside, but an extension of our own awareness, waiting for us to discover our true role in its creation? To explore the dissolution of the boundary between the observer and the observed is to discover that humanity has spent thousands of years building mythic, symbolic, and psychological frameworks around this very mystery. Long before the first particle detectors were built in Copenhagen, our ancestors understood that reality is a responsive mirror, transforming its shape the moment we try to look at it directly. In the ancient philosophical traditions of the East, particularly in the Vedic literature of India, we find the concept of Maya, often translated as illusion, but more accurately understood as the creative, hiding power of the universe. The ancient sages did not suggest that the world is a hallucination with no substance. Instead, they argued that the material world is like a beautifully woven tapestry of light and shadow that appears solid only because we are caught up in its display. The moment you try to isolate a physical object from the consciousness that perceives it, the object ceases to exist as a separate entity. In these traditions, the universe is described as a play of Lila, a cosmic game of hide and seek, where the ultimate reality hides behind its own manifestations, waiting to see if we will look past the surface of the mirror to find the quiet consciousness looking back. This symbolic intuition is mirrored in a famous psychological phenomenon known as the Hawthorne effect, or the observer's paradox. In the early 20th century, researchers studying industrial productivity noticed that no matter what environmental variables they changed, whether they made the factory lights brighter or dimmer, the workers' efficiency consistently improved. The researchers eventually realized that the physical changes in the environment were irrelevant. The workers were not responding to the light. They were responding to the psychological weight of being observed. The simple knowledge that someone was watching them had subtly but permanently restructured their behavior, their focus, and their internal reality. In our own lives, we experience this psychological collapse every day. Think of a time you tried to perform a highly practiced, automatic task, like typing a password, playing a piano piece, or throwing a ball, while someone was watching you closely. The moment your conscious awareness focused on the automatic process, the fluid, subconscious flow was shattered. You fumbled the keys. You missed the shot. By placing the spotlight of observation directly onto a fluid, subconscious system, you forced it to collapse into a rigid, self-conscious state. The observer's gaze does not just measure the system, it freezes it. This dynamic reveals a profound truth about the human psyche. The most creative, generative parts of our minds require a state of unobserved darkness to do their work. Just as a seed must remain buried in the silent, dark soil to germinate, our deepest insights, artistic impulses, and psychological transformations happen in the spaces where we are not consciously looking. If we try to shine the harsh spotlight of analytical observation directly onto our emerging thoughts, we kill them before they can form. We must allow our minds to exist, at least partially, in a state of creative, unobserved probability. As we push this realization to its logical limit, we find ourselves standing at the edge of a breathtaking philosophical landscape. If the universe requires an observer to collapse into a definite state, and if our own minds require a state of unobserved potential to remain creative, then we are participating in a vast, cosmic cycle of breathing. When we look outward, we inhale, pulling the fluid quantum haze into sharp, crystalline focus, organizing space, time, and matter into a stable world. When we look inward, or when we fall asleep, we exhale, letting the material world dissolve back into a quiet ocean of potential. This cycle suggests that our relationship with the universe is not one of passive occupancy, but of intimate, reciprocal creation. We are the lens through which the universe focuses its infinite possibilities into a single, beautifully rendered moment of experience. But if this is true, it changes everything about how we live our lives. If reality is not a cold, unyielding monument set in stone, but a fluid, responsive medium that shifts its geometry based on our observation, then how do we carry this knowledge into our daily lives? How do we use this understanding to transform our relationship with our environments, our anxieties, and the invisible horizons of our future? If the universe is waiting for us to choose its shape, then what kind of reality are we painting with our attention? To bridge the gap between quantum laboratories and the texture of our daily existence, we must examine the ultimate currency of human consciousness: our attention. We have been conditioned by a materialistic culture to view attention as a passive flashlight, illuminating a world that is already fully formed. We assume that if we focus on our anxieties, our failures, or the chaotic noise of our environments, we are simply observing what is already there. But if the fundamental architecture of reality is responsive, then attention is not a flashlight. It is a scalpel, it carving out specific realities from an infinite ocean of potential. Every time we place our attention on a particular narrative, a specific fear, or a recurring memory, we are performing the macro equivalent of a quantum measurement. We are collapsing a fluid cloud of psychological potentials into a hard, unyielding fact. If you walk into a room convinced that the world is a hostile, critical place, your brain's predictive coding will actively filter out the subtle cues of warmth and connection, selecting only the micro-expressions that validate your fear. You have observed a hostile reality into existence. The world didn't start that way. Your attention forced it to collapse into that specific form. This understanding provides us with an extraordinary tool for navigating the hyper-connected, attention-extractive landscape of the modern world. Today, we live in an economy designed to systematically hijack our observation. Algorithms compete to capture our focus, steering our attention toward outrage, division, and scarcity. When millions of minds are funneled into observing the same dark, fractured narratives, we are collectively collapsing our shared cultural reality into its most rigid, hostile manifestation. We become trapped inside a reality engine running on autopilot, fueled by our own unexamined attention. Reclaiming our role as the observer requires what psychologists call meta-attention, the capacity to observe the observer. It is the practice of stepping back from the immediate stream of sensory data and consciously choosing how we filter the quantum haze. When we feel a wave of anxiety rising, instead of diving into the thought and treating it as an objective fact, we can observe it as a passing wave of probability. We recognize that this specific fear is just one possible configuration of the future out of an infinite number of potentials. By simply watching the anxiety without identifying with it, we prevent it from solidifying. We deny it the information it needs to lock itself into a permanent psychological loop. This shift in perspective is echoed by a remarkable neurological phenomenon known as neuroplasticity. For decades, traditional medicine believed that the brain's physical structure was fixed by adulthood. We now know that the physical synapses, pathways, and structures of the brain are continuously being remodeled based on where we place our focus. When you consciously redirect your attention away from a deeply ingrained habit or a negative thought loop and toward a new behavior or a state of gratitude, the old neural pathways literally begin to wither away from neglect. The new pathways strengthen, myelinating, and solidifying into a new physical infrastructure. Your attention is physically reshaping the gray matter inside your skull. You are observing a new brain into existence. This integration reveals that the hidden architecture of reality is not a prison we are trapped inside, but an open invitation. The universe is not an indifferent machine that dictates our thoughts, our feelings, and our destinies from the outside. It is an infinitely malleable medium, waiting in a state of suspended animation for us to decide what it should become. By taking responsibility for what we observe, we transition from being passive characters in a pre-written script to active authors of the unfolding narrative. We begin to understand that the most powerful form of agency we possess is not our ability to manipulate the external world through force, but our ability to choose which reality we collapse with our gaze. Yet, as we master this architecture of attention, we are pulled toward one final, breathtaking implication. If our individual minds can collapse possibilities into concrete experiences, what happens when we look beyond our personal horizons? If the entire cosmos is an interconnected web of observer and observed, what was reality doing before human consciousness evolved to witness it? Who or what was holding the universe together in the dark billions of years before the first eye opened to gaze at the stars? This is the ultimate paradox of a participatory universe. If reality requires an observer to transition from a fuzzy cloud of probabilities into a concrete physical state, then the early universe presents a massive conceptual roadblock. For nearly 14 billion years, the physicists and philosophers have wrestled with this question, and their answers split into two fascinating paths. The first path is grounded in the concept of environmental decoherence. This theory suggests that the observer does not need to be a conscious human being in a white lab coat. Instead, any physical interaction between a quantum particle and its environment acts as a measurement. When a photon of light strikes a grain of cosmic dust in the deep vacuum of space, information is exchanged. The environment reads the state of the photon, and the wave function collapses. In this view, the universe is constantly measuring itself. Every atomic collision, every gravitational pull, and every stray photon of light acts as a tiny observer, weaving the tapestry of physical reality together in a continuous, decentralized chain reaction. But there is a second, far more radical path, one championed by the legendary physicist John Archibald Wheeler. Wheeler proposed that time itself might not be the rigid, linear sequence we assume it to be. Through his famous delayed choice experiment, Wheeler demonstrated that a measurement made in the present can actively decide the history of a photon that began its journey in the past, expanded, cooled, and formed galaxies, stars, and planets long before any biological life emerged to witness it. If there were no eyes to look, no minds to measure, and no consciousness to collapse the wave function, how did the universe manage to materialize at all? Why didn't it remain a silent, ghostly mist of infinite, unconcepted possibilities? If we scale this quantum behavior up to a cosmic level, a mind-bending possibility emerges. The participatory anthropic principle. Wheeler suggested that our observations today, in the present, might reach backward through deep time to collapse the highly uncertain, probabilistic state of the early universe. By looking back at the light of distant stars, we are retroactively bringing the history of the cosmos into definite existence. We are the observers who, by witnessing the universe now, validate its existence from the very beginning. Whether through the quiet, constant whispering of atoms interacting in the dark, or through a massive loop of consciousness reaching across billions of light years to create its own past, one thing is clear. We are not separate from the cosmos. We are the universe looking back at itself, waking up to its own potential, and deciding, one conscious choice at all times, what kind of reality we want to collapse into being.